In the late summer of 1971, a 25-year-old woman named Vera Calloway stood before the Sumner County Commission in a borrowed dress that felt as stiff and unnatural as the air in the wood-paneled courtroom. The 5 men seated behind the elevated dais looked down at her not with malice, but with a kind of weary, paternalistic amusement. They were men of substance, men who dealt in budgets and bridges and property taxes, and they were accustomed to hearing requests for road paving or variances for new barns. They were not accustomed to this. Before them was a young woman, barely old enough to have a history of her own, asking to take possession of the county's most significant and unsightly liability, the old North Pike gravel pits. 113 acres of ruin. Let me paint you a picture of this place. For 30 years, from the 40s through the 60s, it had been a wound in the earth, a place of diesel smoke and grinding machinery. Great shovels had clawed at the land, tearing out the stone and sand that would become the beds for 1,000 miles of county roads. But the veins of good gravel had run their course, and the company that leased the land had packed up its machines, fulfilled its contract, and simply vanished, leaving behind a landscape that looked like the surface of a dead moon. There were a dozen or so pits, some small enough to be ponds, others vast enough to be called lakes, all of them irregular, jagged, and frighteningly deep. The sides were steep cliffs of raw clay and shale. Twisted rebar and forgotten lengths of cable snaked out from the murky water's edge like metallic weeds. The locals called it the Scab. It was a place where teenagers dared each other to jump from the cliffs, and where sensible people warned their children to never, ever go. It was worthless. You couldn't farm it, you couldn't build on it, and the county had spent the better part of 5 years trying to figure out how to either fill it in or fence it off permanently, both options being prohibitively expensive. And now, here was Vera Calloway, daughter of a quiet farmer, granddaughter of a man most folks remembered only as a reclusive tinkerer, asking for it. She didn't want the county to pay her to take it. She was offering to take it, assume all liability, for the cost of the filing fees. A sum of $150. The chairman of the commission, a man named Mr. Blevins with a jowly face and a voice that sounded like gravel rolling downhill, leaned forward into his microphone. "Miss Calloway," he began, his tone a careful mixture of politeness and condescension, "could you explain to the commission what your intentions are for this property? The county has it appraised at, well, frankly, the appraisal value is negative, considering the cost of remediation." A few of the men chuckled softly. They weren't being cruel. They were simply stating a fact as they understood it. They saw a young, naive woman with an idea that made no practical sense. They saw a problem they could offload. Vera stood a little straighter. Her voice, when it came, was not loud, but it was as clear and steady as a deep, slow-moving river. "I intend to make it productive, Mr. Blevins." "Productive?" he asked, one eyebrow raised. "In what capacity? We've had geologists and engineers look at that land. There's nothing left to take out of it, and you can't put anything on it." "I'm not interested in what's under the ground," Vera said. "I'm interested in the water." This was met with a moment of baffled silence. The men looked at each other. The water in those pits was a danger, a drowning hazard. It was a stagnant, ugly soup of algae and submerged junk. What could anyone possibly want with that water? Mr. Blevins cleared his throat. "Young lady, we appreciate your civic interest, but the county cannot be party to a project that, well, a project that has no conceivable chance of success and carries significant risk. What do you plan to do with the water?" "I plan to fill it with fish," she said. The room, which had been holding a fragile silence, finally broke. It wasn't a roar of laughter, but a wave of snorts and suppressed chuckles. One commissioner turned to another and whispered something, his hand covering his mouth. Mr. Blevins, to his credit, held his composure, but the corner of his mouth twitched. The idea was absurd. People fished in the Cumberland River, in Old Hickory Lake. You didn't fish in a gravel pit. You certainly didn't build a business on it. He saw a girl with a romantic, foolish dream. "All right, Miss Calloway," he said, tapping his pen on the desk, signaling the end of the discussion. "The commission will take your proposal under advisement." It was the polite, bureaucratic way of saying no. But Vera did not move. She just stood there, her gaze unwavering. She was an outsider, a young woman in a world run by men who believed they knew the absolute measure of all things, and they had measured her and her idea and found them wanting. Now, let me tell you about Vera. She was not a dreamer, not in the way those men thought. She was an observer. She was a scholar of a science that had no formal name, taught by a professor who had no degree. Her grandfather, Elias Calloway, had been that professor. He was a man who had farmed his whole life, but whose true passion lay in the hidden, intricate world of freshwater ecology. He had been a fisherman, but not the kind who cared for trophies. He cared for the system. He was fascinated by the delicate dance between predator and prey, between water chemistry and plant life, between the sun and the smallest microorganisms. While other girls her age were learning to bake or sew, Vera was learning to read the water. Her grandfather never sat her down for formal lessons. The learning happened in the doing, in the quiet hours spent together in a small john boat on a hidden pond or walking the banks of a creek. He taught her to identify the larvae of a dozen different aquatic insects, explaining which ones the bluegill favored and at what time of year. He showed her how to test the pH of water with a simple litmus strip and what it meant. "Water has a mood, Vera," he would say, his voice a low rumble. "Sometimes it's sour, sometimes it's sweet. The fish know. They know before you do." He taught her about the importance of a forage base. He would often say, "Anyone can throw a base in a pond. That's just arrogance." The smart man spends a year building the kitchen before he invites the king to dinner. The kitchen, in his analogy, was the teeming, self-sustaining population of minnows and baitfish that a predator like the largemouth bass needed to thrive. Without a full pantry, the king would starve or, worse, eat his own young and the whole system would collapse. His greatest treasure was not his land or his small savings. It was a collection of 3-ring binders, 7 of them in total, that he kept on a shelf in his workshop. They were filled with handwritten notes, meticulous records of his own private experiments on the small ponds he managed. There were pages dedicated to the growth rates of golden shiners, with tables tracking their size and number over years. There were drawings of different aquatic weeds, with notes on which ones provided the best cover for fry and which ones would choke a pond to death. He had detailed the exact tonnage of agricultural lime needed to alter the pH of an acre-foot of water by 1 point. It was a complete, practical encyclopedia of creating life from scratch. It was a work of genius, hidden in the plain scrawl of a dirt farmer. Before he died, he gave them to Vera. "You see the world different than most," he told her, his hand resting on top of the binders. "Don't ever let them convince you that what you see isn't real." So when Vera looked at the scab, she did not see what Mr. Blevins and the others saw. They saw a scar. She saw a gift. They saw ugly, dangerous holes. She saw a series of perfectly formed, independent aquatic laboratories. The irregular shapes and sudden drop-offs that made the land useless for construction were, to her grandfather-trained eye, ideal underwater structures. They were ledges, points, and humps, the exact kind of terrain that concentrated baitfish and attracted large predator fish. The 30 years of excavation had done the work for her, carving out a perfect habitat. She had done her homework. She had taken water samples secretly over the course of a year, wading into the shallows when no one was around. The water was not stagnant, as everyone believed. It was fed by clean, cold groundwater seeping through the limestone that had been exposed by the digging. The pH was low, acidic, but that was a problem she knew exactly how to solve. Her grandfather's journals had a whole chapter on it. The water was deep, which meant it would stay cool in the brutal Tennessee summers, allowing fish to grow larger and live longer. The lack of an existing fish population wasn't a problem, it was an advantage. It was a blank slate, a perfect, empty canvas. She didn't have to correct a broken system. She could build a perfect one from the ground up. 2 weeks after the meeting, she received a letter from the county. To her surprise, they had accepted her proposal. Mr. Blevins had likely convinced the others it was the cheapest way to rid themselves of a nagging problem. They included a contract drawn up by the county attorney, a document thick with clauses absolving them of any and all liability in perpetuity. They saw it as a victory, a clever bit of administrative maneuvering. They had no idea they were handing her a kingdom. The day after she filed the deed, Vera walked into the First National Bank of Gallatin. She went to the teller and asked to withdraw her entire savings account. The sum was $10,000. It was money she had inherited from her grandfather, supplemented by years of working part-time jobs and living with a frugality that bordered on asceticism. The bank manager, a man named Mr. Patterson, called her into his office. He was a kind man, and he had known her family for years. "Vera," he said, gesturing for her to sit, $10,000 is a lot of money. May I ask what this is for? If you're thinking about a down payment on a house, I could help you structure a loan. It's not for a house, Mr. Patterson, she said calmly. A car then? Some land? I already have the land, she replied. This is for the livestock. Mr. Patterson visibly relaxed. Oh, excellent. Cattle? That's a fine investment. Your father would be proud. Not cattle, Vera said, looking him directly in the eye. Fish. He stared at her, his friendly smile faltering. I'm sorry? I'm buying fish, she repeated. $10,000 worth. Bluegill to start, then golden shiners, and in a few years, largemouth bass. Mr. Patterson leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking in the silent office. He looked at the young woman sitting before him, earnest and resolute, and he saw the same thing the county commission had seen, a well-meaning but tragically misguided girl. He tried to reason with her, explaining the nature of risk, the wisdom of diversified assets, the folly of putting every penny into such an unorthodox venture. She listened politely, nodded, and when he was finished, she said, I understand the risk. I'd like the money in cash, please. The subsequent 2 decades were a masterclass in patience. The first 2 years were dedicated entirely to chemistry. Vera bought agricultural lime by the ton, loading the heavy bags into a small rowboat and painstakingly spreading it across the surfaces of the pits. She did this again and again, guided by her water tests and her grandfather's charts, slowly sweetening the acidic water, nudging the pH from a hostile 5.5 to a life-sustaining 7. The land was asleep, and she was gently waking it. The water, which had been murky and brown, began to clear as the clay particles settled in the more balanced chemistry. For the first time, sunlight could penetrate deeper into the water column. Then came the kitchen. She spent the first $5,000 not on the prize fish, but on their food. She ordered tens of thousands of bluegill and fathead minnows, tiny fingerlings that arrived in oxygenated bags on the back of a hatchery truck. The driver looked around at the desolate landscape and shook his head. Ma'am, you sure this is the right place? He asked. Vera just nodded and signed the paperwork. For 2 years, she did nothing but let that forage base reproduce. She sank brush piles made from old Christmas trees donated by her neighbors who thought her an eccentric but harmless recycler to give the young fish cover. She planted beds of coontail and eelgrass, creating nurseries. The pits, once silent and sterile, began to hum with a low thrum of life. Schools of shiners would flash like scattered silver coins in the afternoon sun. During this time, the whispers from the community continued. "That Calloway girl is still out there digging in the mud," they'd say at the feed store. They saw her as a tragic figure, a lonely spinster wasting her youth on a pile of rocks. They saw no progress because they didn't know what to look for. They were looking for a building, a crop, something they recognized as value. They could not see the invisible booming ecosystem she was building beneath the surface. There was a moment in the third winter when she nearly gave up. A brutal cold snap had frozen the shallower pits solid, and she feared a massive fish kill. The work was lonely, the progress invisible to anyone but her, and the weight of the community's skepticism pressed down on her like the cold, gray sky. She sat in her grandfather's old workshop, the air smelling of oil and sawdust, and looked at her chapped, raw hands. The doubt was a physical ache. Was she a fool? Had she misread the signs? Had she wasted her inheritance and her life on a ghost story whispered to her by an old man? She pulled one of the binders from the shelf and opened it to a random page. Her grandfather's steady, unadorned script met her eyes. "Patience is not waiting," he had written. "It is working while you wait. The land does not hurry, but it always arrives at its destination. Your job is to make sure it's a good one." In that moment, the doubt receded. The land remembered the work. He was right. She put on her coat and went back out to break the ice near the edges of the ponds. Finally, in the spring of the 5th year, the kitchen was ready. The forage base was explosive. The pits were teeming with millions of healthy, breeding baitfish. It was time to invite the king to dinner. She spent the last of her $5,000 on a special order of pure strain Florida strain largemouth bass fingerlings, a subspecies known for its potential to grow to enormous sizes. She introduced them carefully, a few hundred into each of the larger pits, and then she waited again. This was the hardest wait of all. For 5 more years, she let them grow, feeding on the bounty she had prepared. She protected them fiercely, allowing no one to fish the property. The legends grew. Local boys would sneak onto the property and come back with tales of seeing bass as big as a hog's leg shadowing the shorelines. Most people dismissed it as exaggeration. In the 10th year after she acquired the land, Vera Calloway quietly opened the Calloway Pits Trophy Bass Club. It was a private, members-only establishment. The fee was steep, but the rules were simple: catch and release only, single barbless hooks, and you treated the land with respect. The first dozen members were serious tournament fishermen from Nashville and Knoxville, men who had heard the whispers and were willing to gamble on the legend. What they found was beyond anything they had ever imagined. They were accustomed to fishing public lakes where a 5-pound bass was a trophy. In Vera's pits, 5-pounders were common. They caught 7-pounders, 9-pounders. One man, a lawyer from Memphis, landed a bass that weighed 13 pounds, 4 ounces of fish that would have been a state record had it been caught in public water. The man sat in his boat, holding the fish in the water, simply staring at it in awe for a full minute before letting it go. He looked over at Vera, who was watching from the bank. He didn't say a word. He just nodded, a look of profound respect on his face. Word of mouth did the rest. The membership list filled up, then had a waiting list. Vera started offering guided trips, charging a premium for her personal expertise. She knew every ledge, every drop-off, every sunken brush pile. She knew what the bass were eating on any given day, at any given hour. Fishing with her wasn't just a trip, it was an education. The worthless land began to generate an income that rivaled some of the best farms in the county. She added a small rustic campground, a bait shop, and hosted lucrative high-stakes base tournaments. The Scab had become a destination. Then, one autumn afternoon, nearly 20 years after she had stood before the county commission, a dusty sedan pulled up to her small office. An old man got out, moving slowly. It was Mr. Blevins. He was long retired, his face softer and his eyes holding a different kind of weariness now. He looked around, at the manicured banks, the clear water, the boats gliding silently across the surfaces of what he had only ever known as ugly holes. Vera came out to meet him. She had not seen him in 2 decades. "Miss Calloway," he said, his voice now thin, not booming. I was just driving by. I hardly recognized the place." "It's changed some," she said, her voice still quiet, still steady. He walked with her to the edge of the largest pit, the water a deep, placid blue. A fisherman across the lake let out a whoop as his rod bent double. Mr. Blevins watched for a moment, then turned back to her. There was no condescension left in his eyes, only a deep and genuine curiosity. A question he had probably been holding for years. "How?" he asked. It was a simple word, but it contained everything. How did you do this? How did you see this? How did you know we were all so wrong? Vera looked out over the water, her water, and a small smile touched her lips. It was not a smile of triumph, but of simple, quiet satisfaction. "You all saw a hole in the ground," she said. "You saw what had been taken away. My grandfather taught me to see what the land wants to become next." "A fish pond," Blevins said, shaking his head in wonder. "No," Vera corrected him gently. "He taught me that you don't build a pond for the fish. You build it for the minnows. If you make the smallest things happy, the big things take care of themselves. It's not a fish pond, Mr. Blevins. It's a kitchen." He stood there, silent, comprehending at last the depth of the philosophy he had once dismissed as a girlish whim. He saw the years of labor, the solitary belief, the profound wisdom that had transformed a scar into a sanctuary. He saw a legacy built, not with bricks and mortar, but with water and life, and above all, with patience. Finally, he looked at her, the woman who had once been a girl in a borrowed dress, now the undisputed master of her own kingdom. "Well, I'll be," he breathed. "The county owes you an apology, ma'am. We saw a liability. You built an asset nobody else even had the imagination to dream of." He extended a frail, spotted hand. "You did good, Vera. You did real good." The narrative, of course, did not end there. It jumped forward again, another 20 years. Vera Calloway was now in her late 60s, a respected elder in the community, a legend in the world of conservation and land management. She owned her 113 acres free and clear, a property that was now one of the most valuable rural parcels in the state, not for what could be built on it, but for the pristine, unique ecosystem it contained. The pits, once a symbol of industrial ruin, were now seen as a model of ecological restoration. University students came to study the water, to marvel at the perfect balance she had engineered through sheer will and ancestral knowledge. She never married, never had children of her own. The land was her family, the rhythm of the seasons her partner. But she was not alone. Her legacy was ensured. On a warm spring evening, you could find her down by the water's edge, not with a client, but with her grandnephew, a boy of 10 with curious eyes. She wasn't teaching him to cast a line or bait a hook. She was kneeling in the damp earth, showing him a small gelatinous mass of eggs clinging to an underwater reed. "That's the start of it all," she'd tell him, her voice the same steady, calm tone she'd used in the courtroom 50 years earlier. "That's the pantry. That's the kitchen." And later, back in the workshop, she would take down a dusty leather-bound binder from the shelf. she'd open it and place it in the boy's hands. The tangible legacy passed to a new generation. The county commissioners had looked at a hole and seen only the past, an ugly history to be forgotten. Vera Calloway looked at the same hole and saw the future. The men of substance said the land was worthless. She listened to the land, and it told her what it was worth. And the land, as her grandfather had promised, had remembered. It had remembered every bag of lime, every sunken tree, every patient day, and it had repaid her in a currency far more valuable than money, life itself.